Hello, IB and AP students. Let's get into chapter 7, all about cellular respiration and fermentation. So, cellular respiration is the process of getting energy from molecules, from food molecules. Plants do this, animals do this. Life depends on energy, and cellular respiration is the way that we do it. And so, in this video, we're going to be looking at this first, you must know. And then in the next few videos, we're going to be getting into these ones. But this video really does kind of lay the groundwork for the next few videos. It's going to be really important that you understand a lot of these terms and ideas because this next chapter is a lot of chemistry. And so you're going to need to understand how molecules move, how energy is transferred in order for you to really understand what cellular respiration is and its important for living and its importance for living things. So let's get into our lecture. All right, so what is cellular respiration? Cellular respiration is the harvesting of chemical energy. So if you were to take a molecule is made up of atoms that are bonded together, and those bonds, those covalent bonds, are the sharing of electrons. If you were to break those bonds, you're going to be able to harvest, you're going to be able to use that energy. That's called chemical energy. And that chemical energy essentially is going to get stored in a molecule of ATP. And let's review from last chapter what ATP is. Remember that ATP is a molecule, adenosine triphosphate. There's an adenine and 3 phosphate groups attached to it. And those phosphate groups have oxygen atoms in them that are negatively charged, 3 of them in a row. And so if you were to break off or hydrolyze or cut off that last phosphate group, phosphorylate is what it's called, the ATP molecule, you're going to release some energy. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of energy stored, potential energy stored in the bond between the second and the third phosphate. And so when that phosphate group breaks, then that energy is now going to be able to be used for cellular work. And a lot of times what happens is that last phosphate, that it's called inorganic phosphate, is going to go and attach onto something else. For example, it can go attach onto an enzyme. And when that inorganic phosphate attaches onto an enzyme, it supplies that enzyme with the energy it needs to change its shape or have a conformation change, right? To open up the active site or whatever it may be. So that's what happens when you break off that bond. But then let's say you want to recycle ADP and ATP and you want to make ATP again. Well, remember that adenosine diphosphate is more stable than ATP, right? And this has a lower energy. And the universe tends to like to stay in a low energy state. So molecules in the universe like low energy, so they're going to resist changes or having to increase energy. And so in order to get this last phosphate group back on the train, you're going to need to input some energy, right? Because that last phosphate and adenosine diphosphate has a negative oxygen atom. If you were to take that negative phosphate group with that negative oxygen atom and try to put it close, it's going to act like a magnet. It's going to push away. So you're going to need some energy to add on that last phosphate group. And so this comes from cellular respiration. So literally the taking of your food and chopping up the bonds that make up your food is the energy that is supplied to add on that lost phosphate group to regenerate ATP. So this is the whole purpose of cellular respiration. We need to get to this spot here where we're taking ADP and we're adding a phosphate group to make ATP, right? So in this case, we're doing anabolism, an anabolic reaction. We're building a molecule. In this, we're doing catabolism. We're taking apart a molecule, right? This results in a release of energy, right? It's an exergonic reaction. This is an endergonic reaction. It requires energy in order to work. Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit. Why do we need to eat food? What are we getting from our food? And how is it connected to this whole ATP thing? Well, we know that animals are heterotrophs, so we don't have the ability to actually make our own food. So we need to take in food from other organisms that are living. Hetero means different and troph means food. So we get food from things that are different. And this is opposed to autotrophs. Autotrophs get energy from themselves. Auto means self, troph means food. So plants are autotrophs. So we need to take in food. And food actually fulfills 3 different needs of ours. The first is fuel. So it gives us the chemical energy for the production of ATP. So remember, we need chemical energy in order to build that ATP molecule, right? We need input energy here to get our ATP, which now can be broken again to supply energy other places. The second reason why we need food is for raw materials. So when you eat food, when you eat like a hamburger, right? There's macromolecules or biomolecules that are making up the food in that, making up the burger or whatever you're eating, right? And so those molecules would be like proteins or carbohydrates or lipids. And those are carbon based. They are made up of a bunch of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygen atoms. And so when your body takes in that food, it's going to break apart those molecules and it's going to recycle those atoms to build new things, right? Think about your cells. Think about what your cells are made up of. Think about the plasma membrane, right? Your plasma membrane is literally made up of lipids. Where do you think those lipids came from? They came from your food. They came from the lipids that you ate, and your cells just recycled them and built more cells out of them, right? Think about the fact that you have carbohydrates within your cell membrane. Where did those carbohydrates come? They came from your cells, right? Think about proteins. Your cell builds proteins, but it builds them from smaller pieces, from amino acids, right? It takes a bunch of amino acids, puts them together. Where does your cell get those amino acids from? It gets it from your food. So you need to eat so you can get materials to grow new things, synthesis to make new things. And finally, essential materials. So we can't make elements. So we need to take in these elements: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, iron, sodium, magnesium, and calcium, and some others in order to make sure our cells are working properly. Okay, so let's just take a look at an overview of cellular respiration. So again, we just stated here that cellular respiration takes organic molecules like glucose or sugar. We're going to get back to that in a second. And through the help of something called the mitochondria in your cells, you are going to break apart that glucose molecule and you're going to make ATP. ATP powers your cell, so it's kind of like the currency of your cell. It's like the molecule that can be spent to allow your cell to function. And in the same process, some heat is going to be released here. So not all the energy from your food actually gets to make ATP, because we know that in any chemical reaction, the second law of thermodynamics tells us that when energy is converted, not all of that energy is converted. Some of it is lost as heat, right? And that's increasing the entropy of a system or of our universe, because in any chemical reaction, not all of it is actually converted to the new form. Some of it is lost. So we're losing some heat here every time you're breaking down your food. But this process releases some products, carbon dioxide and water, and these now are going to be the reactants for a new system or a new chemical reaction, which is photosynthesis. And this is basically where we get all the energy on our planet anyway, right? Energy from the sun comes in, and plant cells have the special ability to take that energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy in the form of glucose. We'll come back to this in the next chapter. But this process takes carbon dioxide and water, and it basically takes apart the atoms of carbon dioxide and water and rebuilds a new molecule called glucose. And that glucose molecule can then be used to make ATP. So it's a whole process. The whole purpose here is two things: is to convert matter. So this is atoms. Matter means atoms. Convert matter, so from carbon dioxide and water, into organic molecules, and also to convert energy, right? Energy from the sun into chemical energy, and then chemical energy here into ATP, and then recycled. Okay, so energy is stored in organic molecules. Remember, organic molecules are any molecules that are carbon-based. So heterotrophs, we eat food, we eat organic molecules, we digest them. So we take the molecules apart, so all the carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, we break them apart, kind of like taking apart Legos. And again, these serve as raw materials for building and fuels for energy, like we just talked about. Now, when we are taking our food, our organic molecules, we're not just releasing all the energy all at once. It's called a controlled release, and we're going to take a look at what that means in a moment. So there's a series of step-by-step enzyme-controlled reactions. So there are special enzymes that are actually helping the organic molecules, the food that we eat, break apart into and to make energy. Kind of like burning a fuel. So, for example, if you were to, where'd it go? If you were to take like some wood and you were to burn it, you are making heat energy, right? You get some energy out of the molecules that are trapped in this wood. You are going to actually create energy and some heat at the same time. All right, so going back here. So burning fuels, like we say, we're going to take our organic molecules, we're going to take carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, and we're going to use those molecules to get energy. All right, now we just talked about how cellular respiration is a controlled release of energy. So there's step-by-step enzyme-controlled reactions. Now, what does this mean? Well, when you think about a chemical reaction, which is what cellular respiration is, we can think about taking some reactants and converting them to products. And so when we're talking about, like for example, breaking down a molecule, you're taking a larger molecule and you're breaking it down into smaller pieces, catabolism, right? That is results in a release of energy, right? You're taking a high energy molecule with bonds that are really stable and you're breaking it apart into smaller pieces. And we can kind of compare that to this hydroelectric system. So this water that is flowing here. So right now, this water, because it's higher up, it has more potential energy, right? And as it flows down, it spins this turbine and it generates some light, right? It converts energy, it converts potential energy into kinetic as it falls down. And as this is moving, it's going to be converting this kinetic energy into light, right? Light energy. And once all the water has flowed down, it has lost its energy. It has less energy because the energy has been converted over here. We call this a delta G that's less than zero because overall we start off with more energy and our reactants have more energy than our products. And so there's a net release of energy. Energy is being used somewhere else. Okay, so this is one example of what's happening in a chemical reaction. But in cellular respiration, we actually take this, but we do it in multiple steps. And the reason is because once this water has flowed down, you can't reuse it, right? All the energy has been used up to create this light. So that's going to burn out quickly once all the energy has flowed down. But in cellular respiration, there's actually multiple steps. And the reason why this is important is because actually you can get more energy out of it, right? So if you start here, notice up here, this water has a lot of potential energy, right, compared to down here. It's got a lot of potential for it to change its position. And so you'll notice that we see water flowing down here. There's a net release of energy powering this light bulb. But now that energy can be harvested again and it can spin this turbine and light this light bulb, release of energy, release of energy, release. So multiple steps actually allows more energy to be released. And because it's a gradual release, right? So if you just had it all released at once, yes, you would burn this light really brightly in that one reaction. But if you had multiple steps, you'd actually be more efficient because you are kind of saving up some energy each step. So if this was compared to a chemical reaction, these are like our reactants, and this is our products, and we've converted potential energy in our reactants into something new in our products. And now this is the reactant for the next reaction, reactant, product. And now you're gradually releasing energy, and you're actually able to get more energy out of it. All right, so let's take a look at what's actually happening to our food when we take it in. So we take our food in, and really the whole point is to make ATP, right? That's a smaller molecule that can be used in our cell. Now, this ATP can be used for something called our basal resting metabolism. So this is basically like if you were not doing any movement or exercise, if you were just at your normal resting state, this is the ATP that's needed for your body to basically stay alive. It also is the amount of ATP that's needed for you to regulate your temperature. So, as your body is breaking down the food molecules that you eat, it's also producing heat, right? Because when energy is converted, heat is released, the second law of thermodynamics. And so that keeps us warm as humans. And then also, we can use ATP for activity. So, if we want to start moving, if you want to start moving our muscles and contracting our muscles, ATP can actually be used for more than just our basal metabolic resting state. Once we have made ATP and we're doing these basic things, we can also use ATP for synthesis. So we can actually repair our cells, repair molecules in our cells. We can actually use ATP to grow. We can make new cells by dividing original cells, and that takes energy. Or we can use ATP for reproduction. Again, making new cells or even growing our original cells. And then once we have made molecules, we can actually store some of those molecules, right? So let's say we are making a bunch of protein or making a bunch of carbohydrates. you can actually store those molecules as glycogen. So in humans, we store a bunch of carbohydrates in a long chain as stored as glycogen, or fat molecules. Large fat molecules is stored from our food. So again, some of our food is used for ATP to make energy. Some of our food is used to grow new, or basically like create new molecules, or through anabolic reactions, right? We're building new things using ATP. And then some of that food, some of those atoms in the food are used and kind of reshaped to form storage molecules that can be used later if we want to save some for later. So these glycogen and fat molecules can later be broken down into ATP if we don't need it right now. Okay, so again, we talked about how glucose it's actually just one of the molecules, the macromolecules or the biomolecules that can produce ATP, but it's kind of like the model that we use in class. You could also break down some proteins, you could break down lipids, you can break down other types of carbohydrates, but glucose is really the one that we kind of use as the example. So what do we do with glucose? Well, we catabolize it, right? Catabolism is breaking apart a molecule through an exergonic reaction, a release of energy, and that release of energy will produce ATP like we saw earlier in the slides. So here's the overall chemical reaction. Notice from chemistry, you recognize this structure. A chemical reaction is taking some reactants, and then there's some sort of change in matter. So the atoms that actually make up these molecules are going to shift around, break, and reform. And there's a change in energy. Energy is going to be moving around through this reaction. So this is something you're going to need to write down, memorize, know this. I promise you, especially if you continue studying biology after this class, this is going to be like ingrained in your memory forever. So this is the overall reaction. So cellular respiration takes glucose plus oxygen and converts that into carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Here is the chemical formula. So glucose is abbreviated as C6H12O6, 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens, 6 oxygen atoms yields 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules. And in that process, we're taking a large molecule. This is an exergonic reaction. We're releasing heat and we're making ATP. So we're releasing energy, we're making ATP, and also releasing some heat. The heat comes because we're actually doing a chemical reaction where we're transferring energy to ATP. And so anytime you're transferring energy, you're going to create heat as a byproduct. So again, we can kind of compare cellular respiration to combustion. So this is how we can make heat energy by burning fuels in just one step. So remember, when we're burning wood, we're taking parts of a plant. We're taking molecules, these carbohydrates that are built into the wood, right? That are actually making up the wood. And you can burn it, right? Using some oxygen. This is called combustion. So the fire wouldn't go without some oxygen. And you're going to generate some heat. Okay. Now, in respiration, it's similar to like burning up wood, because you're basically releasing the energy that's in this wood to transfer that energy into light and heat when you're burning something. But respiration, we're taking our molecules, we're taking organic molecules like carbohydrates, and we're making ATP. But we're doing it in many small little mini steps, like we saw earlier. And we're actually going to produce less heat. So your body doesn't produce as much heat as it would if you were breaking down like a piece of wood, right? Because we're doing it in small little pieces. So overall, in cellular respiration, what we're doing is we're coupling two types of reactions. So what we're doing is we're taking this big glucose molecule and we're actually doing an exergonic reaction, so catabolism. So we're taking this glucose molecule, we're breaking it up into smaller pieces, and we're chopping it up into carbon dioxide and water with the help of some oxygen. That's catabolism. We're breaking apart and we're releasing energy. Now, where is that energy going? Right? What do we mean when we're releasing energy? Well, that energy is now going to this reaction here, this endergonic reaction. This reaction requires energy. Remember, adenosine diphosphate is a more stable molecule than ATP. Why? Well, it's because adenosine diphosphate has two phosphate groups. Those phosphate groups are very unstable, but three of them are even more unstable, right? And so if you were to add on this third phosphate, it's kind of like that, remember, that toxic friend or that toxic partner that when they get close, it just messes up the whole friend group. And so this does not want to happen. So in order to get this phosphate back on the train, in order to get that friend back in the friend group, it's going to take a lot of energy, right? And so energy comes from the release of energy from glucose to carbon dioxide and water. So it's coupling of reactions. So this exergonic reaction here is used to power this endergonic reaction. And glucose. Here's a picture of glucose. So when we're talking about glucose, we're talking about a carbon-based biomolecule, macromolecule. Here's a 3D structure. It's got like this ring structure, and all these black pieces are carbon atoms. So here's another drawing. These vertices here are carbons, but scientists get lazy, they don't draw them, but we know that they're there. There's also a bunch of hydrogens around here as well, some oxygens like we see in red, and so this is our glucose molecule. And this glucose molecule's got a lot of bonds. And so if you were to break these bonds, you're actually going to be releasing energy, because when you're breaking a bond, remember, you're having the atoms are changing their position, and when they change the position, they're releasing energy because they're converting potential energy, so nearby close bonds, and they're converting that to energy that's now released. So how do we harvest energy from fuel? So if this is our fuel, if this is glucose, it's in the food that we eat, how do we get energy from it? Well, we just talked about this. We digest large molecules into smaller ones. So we take this molecule and imagine we were to chop it all up. And so you just had a bunch of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens laying around. That's the first thing we do. We break bonds, but as we're breaking the bonds, remember, bonds are held together by the sharing of electrons. What happens when bond is broken is that actually you're going to move electrons from one molecule to another, right? So as electrons move, they carry energy with them. So whenever you think about electrons, think about energy. Energy moves in the form of an electron. Remember, an electron is a negatively charged particle. Now, that energy can either be stored in a new bond. So you can take that electron and you can actually create a new bond, right? Remember, a covalent bond is a sharing of electrons. So that electron can go and create a new bond, or that electron can go off and be released as heat, or that electron can be used and harvested to make ATP. So that electron can actually be used to take that third phosphate and add it on to ADP and make ATP again. Okay, so here's an example down here of a sample reaction. So let's say you have these two reactants and you are going to digest these larger molecules and you're going to make smaller ones. I know this example isn't perfect because there's just these shapes, but just stay with me for this time. So let's say we were to break apart this molecule and we were to have it lose an electron. Well, remember, what we're doing when we're breaking molecules apart is we're having them transfer electrons. So there are electrons that are holding this molecule together, and when you break it apart, this electron will be transferred to this one. So it's going to gain an electron. Now remember, when something loses an electron, it's going to become more positively charged. When something gains an electron, it's become more negatively charged. Okay, so notice that in the product side, this molecule now has become more positive. And on this side, this molecule, because it's gained an electron, now it's become more negative. Now, we have some vocabulary to use when we talk about molecules gaining electrons or losing electrons. So, something you're going to have to memorize, okay? You're going to have to write this down. This is so important. I'm going to be using these words a lot, and you're going to have to know what they mean, okay? So, whenever we're talking about a molecule that's losing electrons, another word for that is becoming oxidized. We'll talk about why in a moment. Okay, but whenever you're talking about a molecule losing electrons, becoming more negative, it's becoming oxidized. Whenever you're talking about a molecule that's gaining electrons, becoming more negative, we call it reduced. Now, it seems counterintuitive, right? It's gaining something, but it's reducing. So think about reducing as becoming more negative. Okay, so when we're reducing, we're becoming more negative, we are gaining electrons. Okay, all right, now oxidation is what happens when you become oxidized. Your reduction comes together when you are reduced, right? So this kind of reaction is called a redox reaction. And because they happen at the same time, right? Anytime you're having a molecule that's being oxidized becoming more positive or losing electrons, at the same time, another molecule is also being reduced because that electron had to go somewhere, had to be picked up by someone else, and it got reduced. It's called a redox reaction. Now, when I was learning this, my teacher taught me this phrase, oil rig. Oil rig stands for oxidation is loss. Oxidation is loss. So oxidation is the loss of an electron. Reduction is gain. Reduction is the gain of an electron. So whenever you're thinking about redox reactions, say to yourself, oil rig. Write this down, know it. To this day, I think about this whenever I think of redox reactions. I always say to myself, oil rig, just to remind me. Oxidation, okay, losing electrons. Reduction, okay, that's it. It's gaining electrons. Okay, so keep that in your head. Okay, so in biology, though, there's a little bit of a twist, okay? Because when we're talking about moving electrons, we're actually talking about something else in biology. Let's take a look at what I mean. In living systems, electrons don't move by themselves. Now, this is like very chemistry heavy right now, but what do we know about electrons? Let's think about what we know. Remember, electrons are part of molecules, or they're part of atoms. They're in this valence part of atoms, and they're on the outside, right? And in the center, you usually have a proton and a neutron. These protons and neutrons in the nucleus of an atom. So in living systems, electrons don't just go off by themselves. They actually move with a proton. Now, if you were to have an atom that has one proton and one electron, take a look at your periodic table. This is simply a hydrogen atom. Okay, so when you're thinking about a singular electron, they don't move by themselves. They move with a proton, right? And so if you were to have that, that's simply just called a hydrogen atom. Okay, now that's a little bit confusing, I know, but that's just the way it is in biology. Okay, so whenever we're talking about moving electrons, you're secretly also talking about moving a proton, and those together simply make a hydrogen atom. So we just talked about that. So hydrogen atoms, we can also represent this as H plus. So H plus would just be the proton by itself. If you were to lose that electron, this becomes positively charged, H plus. Or E minus is when you're just talking about an electron. But if you put them together, you're making a hydrogen atom. Okay, so back to our little diagram. Instead of saying this one is losing an electron, you can also speak of it as losing a hydrogen atom. Okay, now I know that's a little tricky. If you need to go back and replay that part of the video, you can. But we're losing electrons when we're breaking bonds, or another way you can think of it is we're losing a hydrogen atom. So, oil rig, oxidation is loss. So, oxidation is the loss of hydrogen atoms. Rig, reduction is gain. So, reducing something means it's gaining a hydrogen atom. Okay, all right. So let's take a look at an example of an actual chemical reaction. So let's take a look at our glucose molecule here. Notice here that the glucose molecule, it's being broken apart, right? This glucose here, for example, it's being torn apart and it's being, something's happening to those electrons in the hydrogen or in the glucose molecule. Okay, and notice that the hydrogens are being taken off. The hydrogens are being broken off. That's what's happening when we're chopping up glucose, is we're actually ripping off those hydrogens. Okay, now, if you're losing hydrogens, okay, is that oxidation or is that reduction? Well, oxidation is loss. You're losing hydrogens, and so this is oxidation, right? So notice here that you had C6H12O6 in your reactants, and now your products have no hydrogen. The hydrogen's been taken off, so you've oxidized glucose to make carbon dioxide. Okay, now where did those hydrogens go? You ripped them off of glucose. They actually went over here to our oxygen, and we have now reduced our oxygen. Reduced, oil rig. Oxidation is lost, reduction is gain. The oxygen has gained the hydrogens, right? And you'll notice here, boop, once it's gained those hydrogens from the glucose, now it has become reduced. It's been reduced because it's gained hydrogens, okay? So that's how we can kind of think of these chemical reactions. Now, when I was learning this for the first time, redox reactions were very complicated to me. For some reason, it kind of like didn't sit right in my mind. So if you need to go watch more videos on this and review them, I highly recommend it. It's kind of a little bit counterintuitive, and there's a lot of pieces to think about. So slow down here if you need and review. Okay, now oxidation and reduction reactions always happen at the same time. And they happen specifically in what we're learning about in cellular respiration. So kind of like a recap of what I just shared. So what's happening is we're releasing energy as we're breaking down molecules. So we're taking this glucose molecule, we're pulling off those hydrogen atoms, and whenever you're breaking bonds, you are releasing energy, right? We're also breaking the carbon-carbon bonds. So we're breaking these bonds here. If we go back to our glucose molecule, notice that this is carbon, this is carbon, carbon, carbon. In the same picture here, carbon, 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 carbon. We're breaking these carbon-carbon bonds and we're releasing energy. My alarm clock is going off. So we are also stripping off electrons from those carbon-hydrogen bonds, right? What does that mean? Well, we're removing those hydrogen atoms. So if you go back to our glucose molecule here, okay, so all these white atoms here, these are hydrogens. And so what you're doing with glucose is you're literally ripping off those hydrogens, right? And so now you are oil rig oxidation cells. You're oxidizing your glucose. You're losing hydrogens. And those hydrogens are going to go somewhere else. They're going to go to your oxygen, and that will reduce your oxygen. Okay, so here we have our glucose, and the glucose has lost hydrogen, so you are oxidizing your glucose. Okay, so you're losing hydrogens. And this releases energy. When you're ripping off those hydrogens, it causes a release of energy, and that energy now goes, like we learned before, to make ATP. Okay. Electrons are more attracted to electronegative atoms. Ooh, what does that mean? Well, we know that thinking about chemistry class, thinking about our first unit, some atoms are more electronegative than others. Electronegative means they like electrons. They're electron greedy. They love electrons. Anytime there's an electron around, they're going to want to grab it. And one of the most electronegative atoms, or in biology, the most electronegative atom, is oxygen. Oxygen is so greedy for hydrogens. They're so greedy for electrons. Remember, when we're saying electrons, we can use that interchangeably with hydrogens. And so this oxygen atom really, really, really wants hydrogens. And so if you strip off those hydrogens from the glucose, the oxygen's immediately going to want to grab them. Okay, so oxygen is our atom, or is our atom that likes to be reduced because it likes to grab onto these hydrogen atoms. So in this example, we have our oxygen, and it's now pulling on and grabbing those hydrogens, and it's being reduced. It loves to take in wandering hydrogen atoms. Okay. All right. So just a summary, oxidation is losing electrons, or another way of thinking about it is removing hydrogen atoms from a molecule. Another way of thinking of oxidation is adding oxygen. Okay, so oxidation, adding oxygen is another way of thinking about it. This overall releases energy because you're breaking bonds, you're removing hydrogen from something, and that's releasing bonds, and it's an exergonic reaction. Again, you're breaking bonds, you're breaking hydrogens off. Reduction is gaining electrons or adding hydrogen or removing oxygen. When I think of it though, I think of where hydrogen's moving around. I tend not to think about this oxygen piece here. Kind of confuses me. This process stores energy, right? Why? Well, you're actually attaching on, you're adding something, right? Anabolism, when you're building something new that requires energy, and now it's storing energy here. This is an endergonic reaction because it requires energy. Now, what does that mean? Remember, when we talk about those electrons, or we talk about hydrogens moving around, those have energy. And so if you're adding hydrogen to an oxygen molecule like this, then you're actually adding energy into the system, and you're using the energy to create a new molecule. You're synthesizing, which requires energy. Okay, something to note here. When you are breaking apart this glucose and you're ripping off those hydrogen atoms, going back to this picture, this is cellular respiration. And we'll go more into detail on this later. When you're taking these hydrogen atoms off, for a moment, those hydrogen atoms are just going to be floating around. And they actually have there's these special molecules that actually are going to grab onto those hydrogen atoms and kind of keep them safe for a little bit before they can be transferred somewhere else to our oxygen eventually, right? So these special molecules are called NAD+. Okay, NAD+. Now, NAD+, right here, has two phosphate groups. It has a sugar and it has bases, right? Like a nucleic acid. And you'll notice here that NAD plus is a little bit different than this molecule on the right. Okay, this molecule on the right is NADH. And notice it looks so similar in structure. It's got these two phosphate groups, it's got this sugar, it's got these bases, these nitrogenous bases, right? These are nucleotides. But notice here that there's this extra hydrogen on top. That's the only difference. There's just an added hydrogen. Okay, so this NAD plus can accept hydrogens. It can attach onto hydrogen. So if you're thinking about oil rig, oxidation is loss, right? So this molecule on the left has hydrogens. It can lose hydrogens, right? It can be oxidized. This molecule on the left, it can gain hydrogens, right? It can be reduced. And so these molecules are really helpful in cellular respiration because they can hold on to those hydrogens for a moment. So this one can easily attach on. This molecule is really generous and wants to donate hydrogens. And those hydrogens can now be used to reduce other molecules. So let's take a look at this even more closely. So these molecules are called electron carriers because they move electrons around. Remember, when we're talking about electrons, we're talking about hydrogen too. Now, these electrons, these hydrogens, are full of energy. So when we're talking about moving electrons, we're talking about moving hydrogens. We're really talking about moving energy around. Okay? So when we look at NAD+, right, it's got one missing hydrogen. If we added on another hydrogen, right, we're adding on a hydrogen, we're reducing this molecule, and we're making it into NADH. Now, there's another electron carrier called FAD2+, and this molecule can actually grab onto some hydrogens, to two other hydrogens, and be reduced, right? Oil rig. Oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. It's gained some hydrogens. It's gained electrons. It's become reduced. It's become more negative. All right. So here is the molecular structure. And this is a nucleotide, right? And notice it has the ability to latch onto a hydrogen to become reduced. And now when you reduce it, it becomes NADH. So the purpose of these molecules, we're going to talk about them a lot more later when we learn more about cellular respiration. But the purpose of them is for them to shuttle or move around hydrogen atoms, right? So that their whole purpose is just to donate or accept hydrogen atoms. All right. Now this molecule can reduce something else. It can donate hydrogens to something else, and it can reduce it. Okay. And it can become oxidized. It can lose hydrogens. So when NADH is oxidized, it goes back to NAD+. So basically they're going back and forth. They're being recycled. And that reaction results in a loss of energy. So the energy, when this hydrogen is ripped off, energy is released. Whenever you're breaking bonds, you're releasing atoms, energy is being released. And this is a lot of energy. Negative 219 kilojoules per mole is the release of energy, delta Gib. So that's a lot of energy that can be used for other places. So the whole reason why you're trying to move these hydrogens around is because every time you're ripping off hydrogens, you're basically releasing a ton of energy that can be used later. Okay, so let's look again here. We have NAD+, that's one type of energy carrier. If you were to add an electron or add hydrogen, are you reducing it or are you oxidizing it or neither? Take a moment, think about it. Oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. If you said 2, reduce, you are correct. So NAD+ is being reduced, right? And so what's happening here is you're adding an electron or you're adding a hydrogen, and it's becoming NAD+. All right, so in this next video, we're going to learn all the steps of cellular respiration. So we kind of just learned some of the background info for us to really understand all the steps. It's a lot of chemistry, it's a lot of steps, there's a lot of words, but hang with us. We will get through it. But just want to give you a quick overview. So cellular respiration happens in 4 metabolic stages. Metabolic means we're either breaking a molecule apart or building something, catabolism or anabolism. So there's two main overall parts. So the first part is called anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic means without. So ana means without. Aerobic with means air. So an means without. Aerobic means air. So this step happens without air. It's respiration without air. And the step is called glycolysis, respiration without oxygen. And this happens in the cytosol of your cell, right? In that fluid space outside, in between all the organelles. That's the first main step. Now, this is just an overview, so it might be helpful for you to write this down just so you can have kind of a model in your head. A lot of this might not make complete sense right now, but once we put it all together, you're really going to understand it. We combine like catabolism, anabolism, redox reactions, and the overall formula of cellular respiration. This model will become much more clear. Okay, so then the second part is called aerobic respiration. This is some sort of respiration using oxygen, and it occurs in your mitochondria. And there's 3 steps. The first step is called pyruvate oxidation. So there's going to be some sort of loss of electrons or loss of hydrogens. The second step is called the Krebs cycle, otherwise known as the citric acid cycle. And then the last step is called the electron transport chain. And notice here, again, we have one step happening in the cytosol, these 2 steps happening in the mitochondria, and we're making ATP in each of these steps. And the most ATP is made in the last step, the electron transport chain. And so when we get into all the details of this, we're going to be coming back to these redox reactions, and they're going to be important. But again, our overall formula, we're going to take glucose, not carbon dioxide, glucose here. We're going to add some oxygen, right, aerobic, and we're going to produce carbon dioxide, 6 water, and some ATP, like we see here. And we're going to generate some heat in the process, because anytime a chemical reaction occurs and you're releasing energy, you're also converting some of that energy to heat.